This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien kicks off today's show with a grain market update. Dan covers futures and cash and how weather uncertainty is impacting the market. Sarah Lancaster, K-State weed specialist, keeps the show rolling for today as she talks about the recipe for pre-emergence herbicides for soybeans and Henbit, the purple weed growers might be seeing in their fields. Concluding the show is Chip Redmond, K-State meteorologist, as he explains how parts of Kansas might see too much rain in the next week. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Friday show with a grain market update from K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. Dan, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
Dan, what trends in the futures market are we currently seeing?
Well, we're dealing with seasonality. We've had, for instance, in the corn market, some strength. When you look at for the May contract, we've traded up as high as just about 520, closed at 482 and a fourth. Had been as low in the last 2 months as about 460. So I think most farmers take that run up from about 420 or so that happened in early March up to the high of about 490 as something very, very positive. And I know the upfront contract jumped up again to 490, but the futures, they were for corn futures, we had dropped below 450 for a little bit. Now we're up to about 466 on Thursday's close. So some positive there. I would say for soybeans, we also had some movement in the soybean market. We had dropped down to a low of about 975 or so within the last several weeks, but have ended up and come up to a little bit below 975. Closed yesterday at 1036 and a half, had been about the 1050 within the last period of time here. When you look back in the history during this calendar year so far for the May contract for soybeans, we'd gotten up to as high as about $11.11. So again, seasonality coming into play. We got some pretty good export demand, some worries about weather, et cetera, and maybe we'll talk about those later. But you do have that in play. And then there's wheat, Kansas hard red winter wheat futures. We've been kind of in this blocky sideways pattern, trading to the high side. Had gotten as low as about 550 for the May contract here within the last month and a half or so. And again, closed at about yesterday, about 557, had been a little bit higher than that of late. So it just seems not uncommon now to see in the wheat market, 10 cents up over here, 10 cents or more down below over there, and just kind of a volatile place. And weather will come into play pretty strongly now for the next several months, months here. We're in April on hard red winter wheat country. Well, the weather for the last half of April on into May, June is just prime time in terms of what we actually get for yields. And it looks pretty dry right now for the last 7 days, but we'll see where all that goes. And again, we can talk about that later. So lots going on. I would say that when you do look at the markets and kind of look at the carries and try to see what signals are giving farmers or agribusiness, you do really see some strong carries in the wheat market from July to May, about 6 cents a bushel a month, 7 cents July to September, 7 cents, almost 8 September to December, 6 again in March. So it really seems like a situation where the markets are pushing wheat out to the future, giving large carries, encouraging people to store. And farmers typically, I don't know that we have many storage hedgers that take advantage of that. They'll look at the carry and think that that's more of a speculative situation to maybe take advantage of. But boy, the grain processors, the elevators, they look at those carries and they see money there. So again, I guess we're in these situations again this year where where do farmers, when they get the crop out, and if they do see carries, do we do something in terms of storage hedges or forward contract hedges, et cetera, if they get a good forward contract bid, that would give them some profitability. We don't typically do that, but in this market, given this uncertainty, it might be something to consider.
And what effect are we seeing on the market when we think about weather uncertainty?
Well, you see a whole bunch of dry, but nobody really worrying terribly about it yet. So you see the calculated soil moisture anomaly in the United States as of, say, April the 16th, and you see really dryness all the way from the Illinois-Indiana border and some into Illinois, all the way over to throughout Nebraska, down into most of Kansas now, up into the South Dakota, parts of North Dakota, Iowa, for the most part having that situation. You also see really other sources of information that we look towards are also indicating quite a bit of dryness. So we'll be able to plant. No problem. Get the crop in. And when it's, for the most part, if it in dry conditions like this, but it will, on the other side of that, raise the question about having adequate moisture to really get the crop underway and go forth. The last 7-day accumulated precipitation versus normal is, I'm looking at a map, and blue color on the U.S. map is lots of extra moisture. A dark brown color on the U.S. state by state map is pretty dry, and we are as dry as a bone in, well, basically anything going to the west of Illinois and all the way down to the U.S.-Mexico border. For the most part, up to South Dakota, there's some wetness up in Canada, North Dakota border, off in there, but so we'll see. That can shift around in a big hurry, but pretty dry there. If you can look at the last 30 days for dryness, really the state that looks the worst at this time is unfortunately ours here in Kansas. Kansas looks pretty dry, and I guess that's why we're so focused on water conservation and no-till, or at least moisture conserving practices to help us grow crops in years like this. Nebraska has some dryness, et cetera, but I guess the game is on in a way. To speak. Hopefully, I don't know if it's so much of a humorous comment, but man, now we're watching the weather here in the U.S. We'll see what happens when the crops get in, and we'll be watching to see what the development of the crops will be.
How currently is the cash market looking?
Cash market in that here is a little better than it was, not as good as everybody wishes it was. That's an honest statement. Again, highest cash corn price right now, $4.92 in Garden City area, and really a Colby 452, Salina 450, 457, Topeka, Hutchinson 460, Pittsburgh about 457. So not a lot of change there. We do have the best forward contract price again for corn for a fall harvest delivery at 471, 5 cents over. Yeah, that would be in that Garden City area again. And grain sorghum, we have seen some strength in grain sorghum prices. Now you've got $4.07 in Garden City, and that same price in Hutchinson, Pittsburgh, and actually Topeka has the strongest price, $4.07, and around just under $4 in Saline and $4.02 out in Colby. So we're coming up on planting decisions. Which crop do we put in? And we have this it's become a perennial decision as to whether, if you don't have much soil profile, do we plant drought-tolerant corn varieties or do we plant grain sorghum varieties? So we'll see how that works itself out. But we did see estimates, as I remember in the prospective plantings report. This was as of March 1st. Corn up about 100,000 acres to 3.1 million, and sorghum up about 300,000 up to 6.3 compared to a year ago. So anyway, we'll see where all that goes. But again, dryness is going to affect some of those cropping decisions. For beans, have the highest price for soybeans. There's one that's over $10. Again, that's in Topeka, 10.06. Everything else, the highest following that's 977 Hutchinson and 972 Salina. Out to the west, a little bit weaker. And then for wheat, again, our challenge is to try to see what pricing opportunities we have, given, again, pretty dry conditions, uncertainty about the wheat market, and new crop wheat. I don't know that many people have old crop wheat right now, unless they're saving it for protein or something, protein premiums. The highest price in the state that I could find was $5.32 in the Hutchinson area, 522 in Salina, 520 in Topeka, lesser elsewhere. And really the issue now that we're watching pretty close would be corn versus soybean. That'll be a challenge. So you've got, again, in the place where you think they're going to grow corn no matter what, out in the southwest Kansas area, the ratio of soybean cash forward contract prices to corn is even 2, which is strongly favoring corn. Where we probably grow soybeans, again, south central part of the state, that ratio is about south central and east central, 2.29, 2.7. Neutral is about 2.3, so about neutral. Out to the west, pretty dry conditions. Out to the elsewhere, lesser so. We've one thing I would say, and our good friend and colleague Guy Allen's talked about it, is at how the lower U.S. dollar has helped us to help spur exports of some of our grains on. And the one that stands out the most, it's kind of surprising to see the numbers that came out on Thursday for the corn exports for the week ending April the 10th. Again, 74 million bushels, which is very, very good. We need a pace of about 52 to meet the USDA's projections. So that's really good. Sorghum's still struggling, really affected by U.S.-China trade tensions. Wheat numbers for exports, just so. For hard red winter, we need about 7.1 million bushels per week to meet the USDA's projection. And we had about 5.25 last week for the week ending April 10th. So a challenge there. And for soybeans, we had about 27 million bushels of soybean exports, but need about a pace of about 13.6 to meet the USDA's projection. However, that's kind of I guess a number that'll fool you, in that the U.S. has a very narrow window, that they're leader in the world export market for soybeans, because that South American crop comes in and just tends to wash over everybody. So you've got that happening now, or starting to happen.
Dan, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you very much. Take care.
That was K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show with K-State weed specialist Sarah Lancaster. Sarah, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Shelby.
Sarah, starting off our conversation, talking about pre-emergence herbicides for soybeans, and what's the recipe usually when it comes to this?
Yeah, so the recipe for pre-emergence herbicides in soybeans, right? So take a step back. We like to have 3 effective herbicides on our key weeds. So that would be Palmer amaranth or water hemp in all likelihood, depending on where you are in the state. So we want 3, right? I know that economically that poses some concerns, but there's data that suggests that you will get better, more consistent weed control with 3 instead of 2 active ingredients. So we want 3. The 3 we typically go for would be a group 15 herbicide. So that would be things like Dual, Warrant, Outlook, or Residua. We want a group 14 herbicide. So that's typically going to be Valor, which would be flumioxazin, or a sulfentrazone type of product. So that would be Spartan or the Authority products. Okay. And so listeners might be familiar with the fact that, like, for the sulfentrazone products, there are quite a few of the Authority products, which are already a premix of sulfentrazone with a group 15 or some other type of product. The other product that we like to recommend for soybeans for pigweed control is metribuzin. Metribuzin is a product that hasn't really been used a ton in soybeans, but it's kind of one of the herbicides du jour, Shelby. There's been a lot of interest in figuring out how high can we push our rates of metribuzin to increase our weed control compared to the risk of soybean injury. So historically, and rightfully so, there's concern about crop injury with metribuzin and with flumioxazin and sulfentrazone as well, right? So I bet if we polled the farmers listening to your show today that, they would all have had some sort of negative experience with crop response with one of those 3 herbicides, okay? But what we're finding is that over time, it seems like maybe our soybeans aren't quite as sensitive as they once were to metribuzin. So just as a result of some of the selection processes, right, in the breeding program. But we have been part of a multi-state study. You can easily go 1/2 pound of metribuzin per acre to even 0.6 of a pound of metribuzin per acre and get 35 plus days of good pigweed control with about 5% or less soybean injury. So really just pretty cosmetic injuries. So that's one that I would encourage folks to take a look at, maybe a little harder than some of the others if they're not using it already. The other interesting thing about metribuzin, and part of why it's getting a lot of attention, is that if you have weeds such as Palmer amaranth that is triazine resistant or atrazine resistant to those group 5 herbicides, because metribuzin is slightly different chemically than atrazine, we find that we can control weeds that are resistant to group 5 herbicides with metribuzin, which is a group 5 herbicide, which that's a story for another day, some of the nuance of herbicide resistance and what that kind of means for our herbicide groups and how we talk about herbicides in terms of their herbicide group. So those are the 3 that I count on for water hemp and Palmer amaranth control: the group 15 herbicides, the group 14 herbicides, and then metribuzin. So the other product, if you have large seeded broadleaf weeds, so thinking common sunflower, if it's not resistant, thinking cockleburrs, things of that nature, one that is often used would be First Rate, or other products that contain the active ingredient chloranthium is the active there. So there's several that have that as a component. The other thing that we talked about in the eUpdate article that kind of, I assume, sparked this interview, Shelby, is just the idea of row spacing. So I've had a couple of graduate students look at row spacing effects, and also, again, a topic for another day, how row spacing interacts with layered residual herbicides. So using a group 15 herbicide with your post-emergence application. But row spacing, narrower row spacing, can be a way to help your herbicide program, right? One of the former weed scientists at Garden City, Randy Curry, some of your listeners will know Dr. Curry, he likes to say that dark is a good herbicide, right? So the faster we can get the canopy to close and stop the light from hitting the soil, the less emergence we're going to get of new weeds, the slower the growth is that we're going to have of weeds that have emerged. So I think those are the main things to think about when we think about, pre-plant or at planting applications of residual herbicides for soybeans.
And while we're thinking about weeds, also want to touch on a World of Weeds article that you had a while back, but is important to talk about now, Henbit. And tell us a little bit about Henbit, Sarah.
Yeah, so Henbit is the weed that is turning the fields that lovely shade of lavender right now. Henbit, even though it's not a super competitive weed in terms of, directly causing yield loss for corn or soybeans, it is a problem, right? As we think about years like this year, those fields that are filled with henbit, they're using that subsoil moisture that we got from the snow this winter that we probably are going to need for our corn and soybean crops here in a few weeks. So that's one reason to think about controlling henbit. It's easily controlled in the fall, right? Or early spring. It's just a matter of getting some residual products out there before it comes up in the fall. Other things to think about with henbit would be the fact that it is actually an alternative host. I was schooled on this recently. An alternative host for soybean cyst and nematode. So soybean farmers, right, one of the things that we're finding in Kansas is lots of populations of soybean cyst nematode, I remember learning about it in Missouri as an undergraduate. That's kind of a silent yield robber, right? We're going to see, 5 to 10 bushel reduction across the field, and over the long term can be pretty harmful for our soybeans. But henbit, its cousin purple dead nettle, those can be hosts for soybean cyst nematodes. And so even though you might not be growing soybeans in the field, you're still actually going to increase the populations of those nematodes because of the presence of henbit, say, before a corn crop. So just another reason to think about why this weed is going to be important to control, even though you can't see, a dollar reduction in your direct yield as a result of competition. So generally speaking, Henbit is not too terribly challenging to control. As I alluded to earlier, the key is just those fall applications or really early spring applications before it starts to flower. Some products that work, Dual Valor in the fall, Metribuzin in the fall, Glean if you're in a wheat crop, that can be an option as well. One thing to note is that here in Kansas, my predecessor, Dallas Peterson, did identify some ALS-resistant Henbit, so products like Glean may not be as effective. One of the reasons Henbit can kind of cause farmers trouble from a control perspective is that if we think about spring burn downs, we put a lot of 2,4-D in those herbicide applications, and so 2,4-D is not a good option to control Henbit. So really those fall applications are the way to go for Henbit.
How do you identify Henbit from purple dead nettle, its cousin?
So both plants are in the mint family. Characteristics of the mint family are that they have square stems, so 4-sided stems, and opposite leaves. The difference between Henbit and purple dead nettle is that Henbit has leaves that are attached directly to the stem, and they look sort of like clamshells or a collar, right? They're kind of ruffled. Purple dead nettle's leaves are more, they come to a point, they're almost kind of heart-shaped, and they have a petiole, so they're not attached directly to the stem. So both of those plants will have the square stems, but Henbit has kind of ruffled leaves that are stuck right on the stem, whereas purple dead nettle has the more pointed leaves that have the petiole. The other thing to think about is that we don't see a ton of purple dead nettle here in Kansas, but if you go to, say, Ohio, they don't see a ton of Henbit. So they do have a little bit. There's places where they cross over, right? Eastern Kansas, Missouri, you can see some crossover, but they definitely have kind of geographic preferences in terms of Henbit being the more western version and cousin, and purple dead nettle being the more eastern cousin.
Sarah, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Always a pleasure, Shelby.
That was Kansas State University wheat specialist Sarah Lancaster as she discussed two topics. The first one being pre-emergence herbicides for soybeans, and the second one being Henbit. You can read more on this topic by checking out two agronomy eUpdate articles, which I will link in today's show notes on agtoday.net. The first one is titled Pre-emergence herbicides for soybeans, and the second one is titled World of Weeds Henbit. As I mentioned, they'll be in today's show notes, but if you want to find them for yourself, you can do that by going to eUpdate.agronomy.ksu.edu. Again, that is eUpdate.agronomy.ksu.edu. The eUpdate newsletters are a great way to stay up to date with what's happening in K-State's Department of Agronomy as well as crops around the state. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you after. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Friday show with K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Chip, what moisture have parts of Kansas seen this past week?
We had a really dry week, to be honest with you, and as we went into middle of the week, things are starting to look pretty concerning. We had temperatures warming. We saw some 90 degrees on Thursday, and even Wednesday was pretty warm. We've had a lot of wind and low humidity, and we've had a lot of fire as well. A lot of just smaller escape fires, but definitely noticed in the fires that I was a part of that prescribed burning was starting to become a little bit more challenging. But then we had a first kind of wave of a storm system that moved through on Wednesday night into Thursday morning that brought scattered showers and storms, and scattered is the way to put it. They really were very narrow corridors of rainfall. And the people that won got anywhere from a quarter to an inch and a half in places. And they were really narrow corridors. We're talking like 25, 30 miles wide corridors. But they went, especially the one just north of I-70 that went down through Topeka and then went south of Kansas City, dropped the most rain and even had some pea-sized hail and was had severe thunderstorm warning all night. Thankfully, there wasn't much observed severe weather. The first sign that spring is here, and then we had those storms, and we had warmer temperatures after that on Thursday. So another sign where those thunderstorms aren't necessarily associated with cold fronts anymore. And we're starting to definitely see warm season precipitation kick in. Definitely feels like spring in Kansas.
What weather can we be expecting for Easter weekend?
The first round of storms you saw on Wednesday night into Thursday was really the onset of a pattern change that we're going to get into, and this weekend's going to really amplify that change quite a bit. Looks like we're going to have more widespread precipitation Friday into Saturday in southeast Kansas mainly. They might extend a little bit further north than that, but overall I don't think it'll be very widespread across the state with another 1, maybe even 2 inches of rain for portions of southeast Kansas. They need it. And then another more potent, more widespread system looks to cross the state, and the low is going to go right over the state, and there'll be plenty of moisture to work with. That'll go Saturday night into Sunday morning on Easter morning, and it looks pretty wet right now. I think there'll be a pretty sharp cutoff somewhere to the west of precipitation, and there will be losers in the western part of the state, unfortunately, especially on the Colorado border. And where that western cutoff ends up is kind of up in the air still. It's going to come down to just when that storm tracks through. But by all things said and done, by the end of the weekend, some folks in central and eastern Kansas might see 3-4 inches of rainfall. So we're definitely starting to see things get wetter now. And I think that's going to have a little bit of a positive feedback as you get into next week. Keep that active pattern around. We're going to keep some stalled fronts. Each cold front that's going to come through is going to stall somewhere in the proximity to Kansas. And we're going to have storm systems that just roll down that cold front. And where that front stalls out, there could be some big winners in precipitation. We might go from not enough to too much, potentially too quick, which is classic climate, right? We average those out. We get normal. But it's a pattern change. And it looks like another chance of storms again on Tuesday into Wednesday, and then potentially another one later that week. And right now, Climate Prediction Center is highlighting even next weekend, the last weekend of April, for above normal precipitation and maybe even excessive moisture. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. We're adding moisture to the atmosphere. That's going to add in some positive feedback, and each system's going to have that moisture to work with now. We've kind of overcome that dry hump, I think, and at least we can hopefully carry this pattern into May at the very least, and maybe keep continuing precipitation chances through the rest of the spring.
As we've gotten really warm, are we going to cool back down with this moisture that we might be seeing?
So what's one of the benefits of adding precipitation to the forecast is now we've got surface moisture to work with. That's going to make the air more moist in general, and it's going to be harder to cool it down. We're going to see temperatures be much more consistent, and the overnight lows are going to creep up. They'll be above normal through the rest of the month, and that's going to keep the chance of a freeze out of the question, I think, for the rest of the month. And looking out even further, we can still have freezes in May. We can have snow in May. Don't see any big cold system in the offing. I see an active moist pattern that should hopefully eliminate that, and just probably could get away with getting things in the ground now and not worried about cold air.
That was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. That's all we have for you this week on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you on Monday.